guys hear me okay? All right. So this talk is going to be a natural follow-up to the previous talk. We're going to go a little deeper on the SRE implementation at LinkedIn.com. We're going to take a look at their journey, what they've been through, and some of the lessons learned that I think are going to be important as we go through, either if you are thinking about implementing SRE in your organization or if you're working with your customers. I think those lessons will be helpful. A real-world implementation, a lot of maturity in that model developed by LinkedIn. My name is Marcelo Bellinaso. I'm part of the Cloud Ops Advocacy team. Some people asked me this morning, what does a Cloud Ops Advocate do, right? Very similar to what a developer advocate do. We are a new team inside Azure Engineering. We're part of the engineering organization at Microsoft. Our main role, essentially, is to spend time to be on the road in the trenches, spending time with ops teams, right? We're all talking about the transformation that is happening, and the ops teams in our companies are also going through that transformation. So our main goal is to be there with them, get their feedback, get their requirements, bring those requirements back into engineering, help make our products better, especially help make Azure a better cloud platform for IT operations teams, okay? If you want to follow our team or follow the conversations, we use the hashtag AZOps. It's probably the easiest way to connect with our team and follow our content. Today, we're not going to talk about our team, of course. We're going to talk about this organization. This is a recent picture of the LinkedIn SRE organization. It is recent. The team did not start with this amount of resources, clearly. So that's why we're going to basically explore their journey today to learn how things went in their implementation process, how they grew from just a handful of people to a team that's core to the LinkedIn business performance today. Okay, a little bit of introduction to SRE. I'm not going to extend the introduction too much because most of you have been through Steven's session. But again, I think some important things to highlight here. SRE started at Google, and it started around 2003. And one of the key things that motivated Google to look for a different approach to IT operations was the hyper-growth stage that they were experiencing in 2003. Many of our companies, or the companies that we work with and support, when they go through a growth stage, we see the need for different ways of doing things, right? And for Google at that time, the problem was, how can I scale my IT operations, my infrastructure, to reach the global scale and the volumes, right, that I'm planning to achieve at a global basis? Clearly, scaling the traditional sysadmin approach wasn't going to work for that situation economically, and it was just too complex to do that. So Google was looking for a new approach. They hired an engineer called Ben Traynor-Sloss, and essentially Ben Traynor started this team from scratch. And Ben defined the principles of what we call today SRE. Those principles are very well articulated in this book, Site Reliability Engineering. The team followed up recently with a workbook with more practical advice on how to implement SRE practices inside your company. Personally, I like the definition, the SRE definition that was given to us by David Blank-Edelman that Steven shared earlier today. SRE as an engineering discipline designed to remove failure out of a system and bring that system to a level of reliability that you desire, okay? Again, we did not talk about perfect reliability or 100% reliability. There is a reason why 100% reliability is not productive and it's not economical, right? We want to have the ability, we want to have the possibility to introduce change in our systems, right? And if we pursue 100% reliability, we close that window. We close the window that we need as a company to innovate, to drive innovation to our customers, okay? If you ask Ben Traynor, that is the definition. It's what happens when you ask a software engineer to design an ops team, okay? The same way Steven shared earlier today, Google was the first company, essentially, to implement those principles. Today, we see a vast number of companies doing that. And we're going to talk today a little bit about the LinkedIn implementation. If you want to know more about how other companies other than Google, how they are implementing SRE principles and practices, I recommend Seeking SRE, written by our colleague David Blank-Edelman, and also recommend an ebook written by Jason Hand. He's now with our team as well, but when he was working for VictorOps, he was essentially the person who drove the implementation of SRE inside that company. So for the gentleman who asked a question about how to implement SRE in an environment like in a startup or a much smaller team, this is a phenomenal resource that details their journey implementing SRE inside a small organization, okay? Before we go to the LinkedIn story, I would like to just go over 3 principles, 3 basic concepts in SRE that are important for us to be on the same page and understand and make the most out of the LinkedIn story. These principles were also shared by Steven, but I'll go quickly over them. SRE believes that operations is a software problem, and what this means is SRE, the SRE team, as a team, is able to define, build engineering solutions, permanent engineering solutions to solve operational problems, okay? It's a mindset. It's a change from the traditional IT operations model where in many cases, or most cases, is more transactional, driven maybe by a ticketing system, right? The SRE approach is embedded, integrated with the developer organizations, with the product teams as well, okay? It's not just a renaming of your teams. It's not a renaming of your job titles, okay? The SRE team works differently. The SRE team needs different skill sets. The SRE team needs people who are able to code. And by coding, I mean writing scripts, writing programs, understanding, developing or having a common language with developers. People who are able to share metrics with the development team, right? We're going to talk a little bit about the LinkedIn experience. We're going to see the importance that those skill sets played, the role that they played in the LinkedIn success. SRE works to automate toil away, toil being defined as those activities that are very, in general, manual, repetitive, devoid of enduring value for the organization. And that's where the development skills or the coding skills become really important. It's not only the skills, it's also the mindset. The SRE teams need people who just don't accept doing toil as their work. The definition, don't accept defining their job as just doing toil all day long, right? And that's where principles like limiting the amount of toil that we allow in our SRE teams is important. Google does that, limiting at 50%. Different companies do in different ways, but the overall concept that we want to automate problems, troubles, issues away, and we want to be able to have the SRE team dedicating time to do project work, project that increases availability, reliability of the entire applications, of the entire infrastructure. And last but not least, maybe the core principle of SRE, so if you really try to understand what are kind of the basic things that define SRE, the overall idea of a reliability goal, the service level objective, coupled with an error budget, those two concepts together, they complement each other, and they enable the team, they enable the company to balance innovation and reliability. The reliability goal, again, we mentioned before, the 100% reliability is probably the wrong goal for most applications, for most online services. So defining this goal in itself is an exercise. And here we see a lot of connection points with DevOps, right? How do we define the right reliability goal for our service? It's not defined by SRE alone, right? It has to be defined in conjunction with other teams. And yes, we need to talk to other people to get that, to accomplish that, right? Right there, you have the need for the teams to work together. That goal is not based on percentage of CPU or disk usage. That goal is a higher level goal that represents something meaningful for our users. What is that is critical for our users? How do they define their experience with our services as successful, as enjoyable, right? That input is essential in the definition of the reliability goal for our application. Once we have that goal established, the difference between 100% reliability and that goal, let's say if we define that 90% is a great goal, 100 minus 90 give us 10%. That 10% is the error budget. And we spend the error budget as we spend any other budget, right? We use it, right? And we try to be within the limits of that error budget. When we exceed the error budget, something important happens, right? We need to make a decision. We need to take actions that increase the reliability because we are eating up that reliability goal that we defined. We are starting to degrade or to cause problems for the user experience, right? And that is the time where the organization needs to be really in sync. That's the time where that executive sponsorship and internal alignment is important because one of the key actions that most organizations take at this time has to do with reducing the release cadence. That's not an easy decision to make, right? Some of the decisions have to do with reprioritizing the work of the engineering team to focus on reliability, to focus on working on actions from the backlog, things like that, right? So that's where the organization alignment, the executive sponsorship comes into play. But these two concepts really allow the organization to balance innovation with reliability for an online service, okay? These are three very basic concepts. Now we're gonna jump into the LinkedIn story, okay? I would like to introduce you Ben Ferguson. He's not gonna be here today, but Ben, he leads the LinkedIn SRE tools organization, and I consider him the chief storyteller for LinkedIn around their SRE story. Ben and the team have done a phenomenal job documenting their SRE journey, and they have a series of blog posts called Every Day is Monday in Operations. If you want to get a link for that, well, we can search, absolutely. I have in my Twitter feed, my pin tweet is actually a link for this series because it's a timeless piece of content that is valuable, full of lessons, valuable for dev and IT ops teams alike. So the story starts essentially in 2010, and LinkedIn was facing exactly the same problem Google was facing in 2003. They were going through a hyper-growth stage. At the time, they had approximately 100 million active users a month, and they're really having troubles keeping the site up. If you transport yourself to 2010, and you remember the major social networks were growing, and they were defining the space that they were playing in. So there was not a clear decision or not a clear idea if all my personal life would live in Facebook or if I should put some of my personal things in LinkedIn and if I should, think about Twitter and other platforms. So the whole space that each social network played was pretty much in definition. This was forcing, so the competitive environment was very, very tough and undefined at that time. So that was forcing LinkedIn to change the way they, or the speed that they release new features, new software into production, right? So again, coming from competitive pressure, the business understood they needed to speed up innovation. And at that time, they were starting to work under an agile DevOps style of work. And the team decided that it was a good time, the leadership decided that it was a good time to change the approach to IT operations as well. Up to this point, they were working in a more traditional environment with the dev teams having full responsibility for the code. When they finished the code, they would throw the code over the mythological fence or wall. Ops would get the code and would not actually have any knowledge about the code, but they were trying to just install and keep it running. The releases were every other week, big releases. They were done after hours, and clearly, big releases done after hours, we know what happens the day after. They were having a lot of problems with that. They had a release branch scheme that was very complex, causing a lot of issues during the merges and during the builds. So they were pretty much operating in a traditional environment, and they were having the traditional problems that a company operating the traditional model has. Being in the Bay Area helped a lot, because in 2010, we didn't have the SRE book, we didn't have the SRE Con, we didn't have the SRE community. But being, again, in the Bay Area really helps with the cross-pollination that happens with the companies that are there. So the LinkedIn leadership knew about SRE, and they decided there was a great time for them to embark in the SRE journey around the same time the dev team was embarking in their DevOps journey, okay? One thing that was really important and that really worked well for LinkedIn was defining the principles for their SRE journey, right? In their case, site up, principle number one, coming from a time where, again, keeping the site up was very difficult, very hard. They had lots of problems with reliability and availability. The team was starting to face or react to outages with a certain complacency, or accepting outages as normal in a way, right? And they decided that site up as a principle was critical, because they needed to change the culture. They needed to create a team with a culture that refuses to accept an outage as a normal state. For a business like LinkedIn, an outage, essentially, the business is not operating. Customers cannot do anything if the site's not up. And the whole company shares responsibility around site up. The second principle, empower developer ownership, also critical. Everyone in the company has responsibility for keeping the site up. The development team also has responsibility for that. So that is one component of empower developer ownership. The other component was the commitment made by the SRE team to support the dev team in their DevOps journey, right? They understood that the dev team, the business, the customers wanted, the business asked for it, and the dev team was going to release much faster. The SRE team made a very specific commitment to support that change that was going to happen in the software development process inside LinkedIn. And the third principle, operations as an engineering platform, going back to the SRE principles, to the basic definitions of SRE, is building permanent solutions that remove failure out of their system, right? And do not spend time with Toil. Think about reliability overall and build solutions that last for a long time. This is an overview of their journey, and here's another lesson I think every time we have a conversation about SRE, there's always the discussion about what it means and how long it takes. SRE, similar to DevOps, is a journey, right? It doesn't happen overnight. I just mentioned that their journey started in 2010. We are in 2018, and they just now consider that they are getting into the last stage here, the engineer phase. So we're going to go through each one of these phases. I'm going to give you like an overview of what are the key characteristics of each one of these stages and what helped the team move along as they went through this journey. Okay? So the first stage, essentially, the teams, when the team was created, the different operations teams were all put under an SRE organization. In the case of LinkedIn, the SRE organization does not report into the dev organization. It's a separate organization. But I also mentioned that the leadership at LinkedIn is very clear about, it was very intentional about enabling the dev teams to go through their Agile and DevOps journey, and enabling the ops team to go through their SRE journey and essentially work in a different way with short feedback loops, right? So each company is different. I just want to illustrate that in the case of LinkedIn, SRE is its own team, essentially. What defines this characteristic, or what are the key characteristics of the firefighter stage, as you can imagine, is pretty much chaos, right? Remember, they were coming from a period of a lot of problems, a lot of reliability and availability problems. You create the SRE team, right? It's a new way of work. People change roles and responsibilities, but behaviors for some time continue the same, right? During this time, while they were ramping up the site-up culture, while they were learning and developing their SRE approach, some of the metrics from this phase are really, staggering. During this time, they had what they call the 6 a.m. shifts. 6 a.m. shifts meant essentially that all engineers that were on call in a given day or in a given week had to be on site at 6 a.m., laptops fired up, coffee on the side, ready to go, because the site would go down between 7 and 10 a.m. with almost certainty, pretty much every single day. And this had to do with the traffic patterns for the application. If you guys want to get more details, I can give some more details offline. But clearly, it was a really tough scenario, right? If you are a support engineer, if you are an SRE engineer, and you have to be in this situation. During this time, the MTTR, the mean time to recovery for outages, was 1,500 minutes. So it's more than a day. And that is the mean time to recovery. And there were so many outages that if you lined up, if they had a chance, or if the outages were lined up perfectly, one next to the other, that would be more than a year with outages, essentially, right? So the scenario was really, really difficult for the team. Of course, there was burnout. Of course, they needed really to double down on building a different approach to operations. And the way they got out of this scenario was first building that side-up culture, right? There was a cultural element there, and there was clearly an element of bringing new skills to the team as well, right? The second pillar for this change internally was what gets measured gets fixed. At this point, they realized that they didn't have the right telemetry for their infrastructure and their applications. So they made a big investment in building a strong monitoring and alerting foundation. That was essential. That was really, really important. The other decision that the SRE team made during this time was to actually expose that data to the entire organization, right? So for the first time, developers actually had data about their applications across the different stages of the application lifecycle. They could essentially build their own reports. They could pull the data. It took some time, of course, for people to take advantage of that, and it took some time for the organization to build an accurate view of what was going on. Everyone has to trust the data, otherwise the data is not useful, right? They made a big investment during this stage to build that infrastructure. The other investment they made here was automation. The idea of automating everything, and here's where new skills into the organization were important, right? They brought engineers that were able to code, they were able to develop apps, they were able to automate most of the operational tasks, right? And that essentially saved them a little bit of time. So instead of running a checklist, spending 1 hour running a checklist or going to reboot a server or something that you know that you're gonna have to do, you build a script for that. You build an app for that. You share your scripts and your apps with your team. You use source control as an infrastructure engineer to enable your team to be successful as well. So that essentially bought them some time, right, to start documenting better their environment, to start understanding better their applications before they got passed into to the ops teams for installation and operation. But above all, that helped the team figure out where they could actually have more value for the entire LinkedIn organization, right? And that was essentially the space of automation, not only on the infrastructure space, but also the software development lifecycle, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about that. So this stage, the Gatekeeper, it's here more for, I would say, completion, right? Lots of companies get into this stage, right? After you stabilize the site, usually, you have some time as an operations team. And what happens is most companies will build a wall around the site. They will create almost like a human wall. In order to deploy here, because now it's stable, you have to go through me, or we have to push these buttons together, or Most companies react that way, and they build processes around that are people-centric. And it's normal, it's natural, but it goes against to everything that the company, LinkedIn, was trying to achieve, to ship faster, to automate the deployment of features, to create a data-driven culture, not only culture, but to enable data-driven decisions, not only decisions made by humans, but also decisions and triggers in their entire infrastructure, right? So LinkedIn accidentally avoided this stage, primarily because the dev teams were much larger than the SRE teams. Just sharing one of the metrics, during this time, they had about 41 developers for one SRE. So if you remember Steven's presentation, kind of the guidance issued or shared by Google, and it's a general guidance in the industry, is that every 10 developers, you have one SRE, right, in the team. That's give or take kind of the general guidance. They were totally outnumbered. There was no way they could do human gatekeeping around that site. So that was the time they realized, okay, we have something here that we can do. If we're not going to build a human wall around this site, how can we help? That's when they started using their, again, newly acquired development skills as part of the SRE team, connecting with their monitoring infrastructure that at this stage was in a much better state of accuracy, and they started automating and playing a bigger role in the software development process. They started connecting metrics from the infrastructure, from their monitoring system, connecting and automating essentially the software lifecycle with a few teams initially, right? But as we will see, this expanded across the company. So they started developing their first initial wins during this stage, okay? And the decision to focus on building tools, not only for infrastructure, to automate the infrastructure needs, but also to automate the software development cycle was essential, because that is what put the SRE team in the critical path, and as part of the core discussions and the core teams to accelerate the release of the software release, to accelerate innovation, right? This time, what defines this characteristic or this phase is really the ability to build relationships or to rebuild relationships damaged in the first two stages, right? This is the time where the SRE team was placing resources within certain development teams. And the results that they were getting by automating everything, by exposing the data, by working side by side, helping the dev teams enable their DevOps transformation. And at this stage, the SRE team had ownership for the entire tooling for the software development lifecycle, right? The teams that were operating under this new model were developing software that was, or services that had a better customer experience and that had better reliability. So the results were starting to speak for themselves. This was the time that the team doubled down on that third principle that we saw before, operations as engineering. That was the time where more development skills were essentially acquired. That was the time where the team got a little bit more, they were able to shift left the conversation about reliability, meaning having SREs participating in the early stage planning for new applications, right? All these things take time, of course, right? And again, that's why there's a journey here, but that was the time the team was able to start influencing the new releases during the planning cycle, right? And this played a big role because, again, the teams that had this model were delivering software that delivered a much better customer experience and also showed to be more reliable, okay? This took the team to what they call the partner phase. And the partner phase is essentially, the way to describe is really, they were able to empower LinkedIn to make the right decisions, to take intelligent risks, right? This had a lot to do with data, this had a lot to do with tooling, right? This is really the first time the proactivity became, or the word proactive shows up here because the team was now part of the entire life cycle. This is where reliability was embedded in the entire life cycle, the software life cycle for LinkedIn. there were situations, some examples that the team shared with us here, where there was a planning discussion, a planning session for a new service, and the SRE team was in the room with their corresponding dev team, and there was a live site issue. And the SRE team or the SRE resources, they were going to, go look and, essentially fight the fire in production. The dev lead for that organization basically said, no. This discussion is going to happen here today. We need the SRE resources here today. We're going to define the architecture of the new system here today. I want these resources here. I'm going to send some of my developers to fight the fire. This is also possible because the SRE organization, with the software development skills, was able to understand as well, right? They have a common language. They were able to understand the code. They were able to participate in the analysis, the code reviews. And at the same time, the engineers, because of the cross-pollination, the software engineers knew about the infrastructure. They knew about not only the architecture, but the automation. They used the same languages. They literally could communicate. And that is the time where LinkedIn was able to implement something that is really a symbol of this integration, which is the joint on-call rotation. There was a time where developers were able to participate in the on-call. There was a time that SRE engineers were able to participate in code reviews, okay? So the transparency between the teams were very, very, essentially, very clear, okay? This is where the roles start to merge, okay? So they consider that they are just getting now into the engineer phase. And in the engineer phase, they like to say, essentially, everyone in the organization, if you ask them, what do you do? Say, I'm an engineer. Everyone is an engineer. Maybe engineers of different stripes, right? But everyone is an engineer, and everyone is there to help the customers win. Everyone is there to help the company win, right? A couple of things that are defining this kind of new frontier for them. They have a new training platform that's having massive growth. So they know how to deal with that growth, going through what they've been through since 2010. Chaos engineer is playing a big role in the SRE team and in the future of the SRE team, and machine learning to help them automate decisions, self-remediation, and self-healing for infrastructure issues using machine learning resources. Those are some of the things that are helping LinkedIn define the next stage for them. I decided to include some market data validation to show that, again, this is not a operations-centric conversation. This is not a dev-centric conversation. The teams came together. The product focus play a big role in bringing the teams together, and the customer centricity that was developed with the bringing the teams together, defining reliability goals that are essentially what is important for customers, really paid off. As you can see, LinkedIn has been essentially rated first for 2 years in a row in a very important study across some really significant categories there. This is not all technology. This is the customer centricity, and this is the product focus in developing the products, launching the products, operating the products, and evolving the products. So the team feels pretty good about these results. If you want to explore SRE a little more, how Microsoft does SRE, some of the basic content and training around SRE, I'm sharing the same links that Steven shared before. More content will come, more training will come. If you want to test some of these capabilities in Azure, just send me a DM on Twitter, or talk to me during the break. I can offer an Azure Pass that gives you credits to test, especially Azure Monitor, App Insights. There are several services there that help you test some of the basic monitoring capabilities that are needed for SRE. No credit card is needed with this pass, just in case, okay? And I'll be happy to connect with all of you and answer any questions at any time. Thank you. I believe we have a few minutes, right?
We
for
do.
questions?
I can't see the clock from here, but that one says we've got 10 minutes left.
Oh, excellent.
I've just got a light shining in my face. I can see the clock, I just can't read it. So I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions. We're due to finish at 12:55, and then we've got an hour and 5 minutes for lunch. So, yeah, before we wrap up, does anybody have any questions? Cool.
When introducing the SRE team, were you able to lift or re-educate some of the ops guys, traditional ops guys, into this team, or was this a totally new team?
No, absolutely. It's not a totally new team. Where they were when they started, right? They started from a very small base. So, one of the characteristics at LinkedIn is that they control a significant portion of their capacity is owned by LinkedIn, right? They do use cloud, but they do have their own infrastructure, right? So there is a knowledge domain that is really important and necessary to require. They never took the approach, SRE is all about hiring developers, so ops is out, developers welcome, you are now SRE. And I was careful to, when I was talking about the principles, the SRE team as an organization is able to code, is able to do code reviews, is able to develop tools, right? But there are certain functions in ops that require, right? And in every company, this is going to be different. Maybe in that example before the 6-person startup, maybe in the early stages, you're gonna have a developer that has some ops background, but in larger companies, right, you can't just replace knowledge, replace the domain knowledge that you need. So in the case of LinkedIn, yes, they started with that base, they grew, but as they grew and as they started placing, collocating SRE resources with the dev teams, most of these SRE resources, they came with, at least with a hybrid background. Does that, yeah? Mm-hmm. Anyone surprised with the kind of how long the journey took for LinkedIn? Again, LinkedIn is a large company, but when they started, they were, you could say they were like a big startup, but they were a startup, right? And with executive sponsorship, with clarity around the competitive environment, the need to speed up innovation, and executive support for the SRE team, still took them 7-8 years.
Brilliant. Any other questions from anyone? Cool.
Hi. Following on from the previous question, really, apart from focusing on the obvious skills that need to be nurtured, i.e. coding and so on, could you give us some examples of other skills we should probably hone in on to get up to speed with SRE type workflows?
Absolutely, absolutely. So when you think about some of the principles of SRE, right? I mentioned how important is the monitoring foundation, the alerting foundation, right? So the whole notion that data needs to be the trigger for decisions, regardless if humans are making those decisions or if you are automating the chain for decisions, right? The entire chain. It has to be based on data, right? So it helps when you bring people to the team that have previous experience in that working that way, or just believe that, or are data driven, if you will. There are other skills for sure. The whole notion that applications are now more and more being developed as online services, right? What it takes to build and manage online services is different than what took resources to build and manage more monolithic, more traditional applications, right? So that skill helps a lot. It comes natural. Now we're talking microservices, we're talking Kubernetes and containers and all these things, right? That helps a lot. We talked about the coding skills. I think those are some of the most essential skills. I think internally we talked a lot about the mental shift. The mental shift is something subtle, but it's something that you can notice in a simple conversation, right? You talk sometimes with people that have been developed an entire career managing, operating in traditional environments, right? Sometimes they made the shift to understand, what it takes, what are the skills and what are the capabilities required to manage online services. Sometimes they were not quite there, right? So I think, the mental shift is something important if you're going to bring resources into building an SRE team.
That was a great question, actually. Thank you. And I think Stephen, who opened this track earlier, is back for the final talk here at the end of the day, and he's going to talk about monitoring.
Excellent.
I believe. So if you want to dive deeper into the data elements, then yeah, come back at the end of the day. Cool. Any other questions from anyone? Brilliant. Well, look. Oh, sorry. Was there a hand up there? Did I see a hand? No, sorry. Got lights shining in my face. It's difficult. Great. Well, look. Oh, here we go. No, that's definitely a hand.
When you implement this SRE, did you get any resistance from the business? How you deal with that one?
Specific at LinkedIn, or if we see companies? Yeah.
All of them.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't say resistance, but the question asked by our friends from ISOs is a common one. Like, this sounds similar to DevOps. I mean, is this different? Is this the same thing? How should you think about those things, right? That's a common one. Yes, they are similar. Yes, they try to solve most of the same problems. They come from a different perspective, and if you study SRE, you're going to see it came from the operations space, and it's more prescriptive. So by reading the SRE materials, I think most ops people will feel, at home, right? It's like the domain, the problem space feels very familiar for a system administrator, right? Not surprisingly, Google was trying to solve this very problem. How do I scale operations, right? I think that's kind of the most common conversation that we have and we see companies having. As far as the relationship with DevOps, they relate really well. They complement each other really well. Again, maybe because SRE goes a little bit deeper on the practices, is more prescriptive. Some of them are only applicable to Google, which is normal. They wrote the book based on their experience. So each company will develop their own practices in some of these domains. But they complement each other really well. In the case of LinkedIn, those two disciplines were being adopted, embraced at the same time, and just creates a natural alignment with the team. The calms principle in DevOps, they connect really well with SRE as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, the original concept for DevOps, of course, was about bringing Dev and Ops closer together. But a lot of what we see in a lot of development in DevOps has been DevOps for developers rather than the sort of full value stream DevOps that we prefer to talk about a lot of the time. But so I think you can contrast sort of DevOps for developers with SRE, which is almost DevOps for Ops people, and I think you've got a brilliant unification there between the two concepts. Cool. So look, we are pretty much out of time. I think we're roughly on schedule, which is awesome. So if you guys are quick, you might make it first into the lunch queue, depending on how all the other tracks are going. And we're back here at 2 o'clock, back here for another talk on SRE with Rick's TV, which should be really interesting to discover more about their journey through site reliability engineering. So thank you, Marcelo.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
See you soon. Cheers.